everyone. I am very excited to be here at PyCascades, and I am going to try and answer your question of, can I use that code? I'm going to be talking about software licenses, focusing on being an end user, and looking at other people's code and telling if you can use it in your project. I'm Holly Becker. I'm a software developer at Sauce Labs. I am a fan of open source, both the software and the resulting community. I like books and board games and bird watching, and another important thing you should know about me is that I am not a lawyer. I did some research for this presentation. It was fascinating, it was informative. It is definitely not legal advice, and you should probably talk to actual legal advice if you have any significant concerns about software licenses, because my internet research was not enough, because software licenses are complicated. There are lots of interactions, there are complexities, there's different requirements which may conflict with each other, there's unclear definitions of terms, occasionally there's terms from legal precedent which is not the country you are living in. Much of this has not been tested in court, so to a certain extent we're just making an educated guess on how the courts might rule if a court case ever came up. This is just a summary to get you thinking about software licenses and how they will affect you. So first of all, what is a license? Specifically, what is a software license? I'm only going to be talking about software licenses. If you have any other creative non-code works, you should look at the Creative Commons set of licenses. A license talks about what you can do and what you must do to be able to do it. It allows uses that default copyright doesn't, which is not very hard because default copyright doesn't allow very much. It talks about how you can run and modify and redistribute the code according to the wishes of the person or people who wrote it, for example, letting you use it in your project. There are lots of different licenses. Fortunately, they can be broken down into a few categories with similar rights and obligations. The most restrictive category is code that is not licensed. This is not, in fact, a license. By default, everything is under copyright and not usable by anyone except the author. However, you can ask the author for permission to use their code, which is kind of what a license is. It's the author answering that question before you've had a chance to ask it. However, this does mean that if it doesn't have a license, you can't use it. This includes code you find on random blog posts or some useful website or some handy tip you found online. You can't use code unless the author says that you can use it. The next category is closed source or proprietary licenses. Generally, you can't use this code, or you can only use it in some restricted sense, like you can run the code but you can't modify or redistribute it, or you can get access to the binary but not the source code, which is a little bit less relevant in Python. A common example of this is a EULA. Yes, I agree to whatever you say, I just want to be able to run this program, probably a video game. Another example is the Unity game engine, which you can use to make video games for free up until you make a certain amount of revenue off of that, and then you have to pay Unity to use it, which is kind of an interesting business model. The first open source category is Copyleft. You can use this code. However, you have some fairly significant obligations associated with it. You have to keep a copy of the license with the code so people know that it's available under the terms of a Copyleft license. Additionally, derivatives also have to be licensed Copyleft. And a derivative can be modifications to the library or anything made with that library. In both cases, the derivative has to be released under a Copyleft license. Copyleft licenses are concerned not just with making software available for other people to use, but keeping it free. It doesn't want open source code used in closed source applications, and the licenses in this category enforce that. Probably the best known example of a Copyleft license is the GPL and the closely related AGPL and LGPL. The other open source category is permissive open source licenses. You can use this code. There are very few restrictions. It usually just requires keeping a copy of the license with the code so people know that they can use it too. Many of the licenses in this category have a few additional things, like they disclaim liability, or they say that using this code is not an endorsement, or they grant patent rights and that sort of thing. Unlike copyleft licenses, permissive open source licenses are not concerned with the derivative's freedom and can be used in closed source and proprietary applications, usually with no problems. This is a very popular category of license. More than half of the packages on PyPI are licensed under one of the permissive open source licenses, usually one of the MIT, BSD, or Apache licenses. The least restrictive category is public domain. You can use this code. There's no restrictions, there's no credit required, there's no license to distribute. In fact, there's no copyright on it anymore. This is the biggest difference to the previous licenses in that it's not actually a license. No one has the copyright anymore. It's explicitly been given up by the authors. And licenses work by using the fact that copyright restricts what you can do. So a license says, well, you can do all these other things that copyright normally says you can't do if you abide by the terms of the license. If there's no copyright, there's no one to set the terms, and so it's not possible to license it anymore. There's also no disclaimer of liability. So if you're looking at setting a license on your own code, you probably want one of the permissive open source licenses instead, although it has been done. The SQLite database is public domain. The example licenses in this category, the unlicensed and CC0, offer public domain-like rights in jurisdictions that don't have the concept of public domain. The last category is not really a useful category of licenses, is joke licenses. The intent is to be both permissive and funny, but often ends up being just really legally problematic because they're written by, frankly, people that aren't lawyers, which causes problems when the lawyers get involved. For example, you can use my code if you buy me a beer. Okay, so I buy you a beer, my company buys you a beer, all of my coworkers at my company buy you a beer. Do we have to hunt you down and find you to buy you a beer before we can use your code? All of this talk about beer is very complicated, and it makes the lawyers upset, and they have to buy themselves a beer to deal with all the resulting headaches. So generally, you want to avoid libraries that are licensed under joke licenses, and you probably want to avoid, or at least be very cautious, setting joke licenses on your own code. You probably want a permissive open source license instead. I'm going to talk about a couple of specific software licenses. Generally, if you're using someone else's code, it's one of the open source licenses. So I'll look at a couple of examples from the copyleft and permissive categories in a little bit more detail to set the stage for discussing how they're going to interact. And yes, there will be a quiz at the end. Starting with the simplest is the MIT license. This is a very simple, permissive, open source license. Basically only requires keeping a copy of the license with the code so that people receiving the code know that it's available under the MIT license. Like basically every other license, it includes a disclaimer of liability, so you can't sue them if the code doesn't work the way you wish it worked. It's actually quite short. It's only about 170 words. So if you want to get started reading software licenses instead of just listening to summaries at conferences, it's a pretty good place to start. And additionally, there's a really good breakdown by a lawyer online if you want to get into the nitty-gritty details. Some of the Python packages licensed under the MIT license are SQL Alchemy and Twisted and 6. The BSD license is very similar to the MIT license. It's another simple, permissive, open source license. It includes a disclaimer of liability. You must keep a copy of the license with the code either in source or in binary form. There's two major versions of the BSD license, the 2-clause and the 3-clause version. The 2-clause is the things that I just said. The 3-clause has an additional line saying that copyright holders do not endorse any derivatives. Using this code does not constitute an endorsement. This makes sense when you realize that BSD stands for Berkeley Software Distribution, and the University of California in Berkeley probably didn't want people saying that Berkeley endorsed them just because they were building something with code that had been written at Berkeley. This is a very popular license. It's used by many Python packages, including NumPy, SciPy, and Pandas from scientific computing, and Django and Flask from web computing. The Apache license is the last of the permissive open source licenses I'll talk about. It's a little bit longer than the previous two. It looks a little bit more like you probably think a software license should look like. It's also more explicit about a few of the things the previous licenses left implicit. Notably, it explicitly addresses patents and grants the patent rights necessary for running and distributing code. Amusingly, there's also a clause saying that those patent rights are revoked if you're involved in a lawsuit over them, so it's got an escape clause there to prevent bad behavior. I was also interested to note that contributions to Apache licensed projects are by default licensed under the Apache license itself, which isn't something that I saw in any of the other licenses I looked at. Among the packages that use it are requests in Selenium, as well as the Android operating system. And last, but definitely not least, is the GPL, or the GNU Public License. This is the best known of the Copyleft licenses. It's fairly long. It definitely has all of the legalese you expect from a software license. It includes all of the things that you're probably coming to expect from a software license at this point. Disclaimer of liability. You have to distribute the GPL with the code that it applies to, so people know it's available under the terms of the GPL. Like the Apache license, version 3 includes an explicit grant of patent rights. And then all of the things that make it a copyleft license. So if you distribute GPL'd code, or modify and then distribute GPL'd code, you must make the source code available. So this means if you don't redistribute the code, if you only use it for personal use or inside your company, you don't have to do anything special. It's only if you give away the code or you start selling it that you have to make the source code available. Additionally, if you include a GPL license dependency in your code base and then redistribute it, you have to make the entire code base available under the terms of the GPL. Remember, copyleft licenses are concerned with keeping software free. They don't want you making something with their code and then not contributing back to the community. Because of this, the GPL is sometimes called a viral license because including GPL licensed code in your code base affects the licensing of the entire program. However, this is where the definition of one program gets a little bit complicated. What's one program versus two programs that are talking to each other? Generally in the past, static and dynamic linking was considered to be one program. The GPL was when C was the primary language rather than Python. Calls to like a web server or piping output to another program are considered to be two separate programs. And in between, things get kind of fuzzy, and it starts depending on really nitpicky technical details of is this one program or two program, and how exactly are they interacting, which is where the lawyers tend to get involved to determine what exactly is one program versus two programs if you want to have a GPL license dependency and your code base is not GPL'd. There's actually two versions of the GPL, version 2 and version 3. I thought there were some really interesting nuances in the differences. One was written in the 90s, the other the early 2000s. It got updated for the internet and patents and that sort of thing, but generally they're pretty much the same license. Famously, the Linux kernel is licensed under the GPL, and additionally Ansible is licensed under the GPL. So that was a lot to cover. Are you ready for the test? This is the interesting part. Can I use that code? We'll be discussing that if your code is licensed X, can you include a dependency that's licensed Y in your code base for closed source, MIT, and GPL? And I'm going to ask you to guess the answer before revealing it to see how good a job I did explaining it. So first up, if my code is closed source, can I include an MIT license dependency? Yes. Excellent. The MIT license has very few restrictions and basically only requires keeping a copy of the license with the code, so closed source projects are not a problem. If my code is closed source, can I include a GPL license dependency? Yeah, probably not. Like, there are workarounds to ensure that your project and the GPL project are separate code bases. You can build an LGPL layer that talks between the GPL part and the closed source part in a compatible way and all that. But you're probably going to want to talk to a lawyer about it to make sure you get that separation correct. But there are some pretty good guides on the internet to get you started. If my code is GPL licensed, can I include an MIT license dependency? Excellent. For the same reasons that it can be included in a closed source project, the MIT is less restrictive than the GPL. Of course, the MIT license still needs, or the MIT licensed code still has to be distributed with the MIT license in it. And interestingly, the entire work of your code base plus the MIT license dependency is available under the GPL, even though just the dependency is available under the MIT license. I did say licenses got kind of complicated. If my code is GPL'd, can I include a GPL license dependency? Yes, two pieces of code with the same license is rarely a problem because they have the same terms and conditions, so they're probably not going to conflict. MIT license code, MIT license dependency. Yes, double yes, it's the same license, and the MIT is very forgiving. This is actually the one I was interested in that led me to do the research that led to this whole presentation. I wanted to know that if my code base was MIT licensed, would I have any problems including a GPL license dependency? Any guesses? Probably not. For many of the same reasons, it's difficult to include a GPL license dependency in a closed source project. The GPL requires that its derivatives be licensed under the GPL as well. So, I mean, I could relicense my project under the GPL, but assuming I want to retain the MIT license on my project, it's going to require the same sorts of careful separation of one program to program to prevent the viral GPL nature from taking over from the MIT license. And you're probably going to want to talk to a lawyer to make sure you get that right. So that's it for how common licenses interact. But whenever I talk about licenses, there's always a few well-known websites that come up that people have questions about. The first one is, I found some code on GitHub, and I can see the source code, so it's open source, right? Wrong. Code on GitHub by default falls under unlicensed, which means full copyright applies and you can't use it at all. The copyright holder has given GitHub the rights to display the code and do some other things like forking, but in general, you can't actually use it. However, most people have realized that this is a problem and have explicitly set a license on their code base, and in those cases, you can use it under the terms of whatever the license is. But by default, you can't, so you have to actually remember to check the license, which also means remembering to put a license on your own repos if you intend for other people to use them, which is something that I tend to forget. And then, what about Stack Overflow? That programming resource we all love. Stack Overflow is complicated. By default, user contributions are licensed under the Creative Commons Attribution Share Alike license, which is a copyleft license for media. But it's not clear if the Creative Commons licenses apply to code. Usually you get around this by setting a Creative Commons license for the text on your website, and you set a software license, usually a permissive open source license for the code. But in this case, the code is not separately licensed. Stack Overflow did discuss moving to an MIT license, or a modified MIT license in 2015-2016, but there were some problems with that idea, and the community had some opinions on it. If you're posting on Stack Overflow itself, probably someone's asking a question and you have an answer, and you want them to be able to take your code and kind of do whatever you want. So you probably want a permissive license, or even maybe public domain. But there's also, for example, codereview.stackexchange, where people are posting entire programs and looking for feedback on them. And they probably don't want people taking their code and doing anything with it. So there wasn't really a license that covered all of those use cases. Additionally, it's complicated because it's not clear that all snippets of code are large enough to be covered by copyright. To be copyrightable, something needs to be original. It needs to have an origin. And there's only so many ways to write a for loop in Python. And the distinction between like small and not original and bigger and original or small and original is kind of fuzzy. So if there's no copyright, then you can't set a license, and then things get complicated. Overall, it's kind of an awkward situation. I am not going to make a recommendation, but I will admit that I use Stack Overflow when I'm programming for inspiration and reference and links to documentation and that sort of thing. In conclusion, there's a few things that I hope you remember from this. The first is that software licenses are fantastic. They allow you to use other people's code, they allow other people to use your code, and all of that results in the open source community, which is why we're all here. Software licenses are also kind of complicated. Permissive open source licenses are simple and straightforward and easy to use. The GPL takes a strong ethical stance. It doesn't want code being used without the users contributing back to the community that it came from. But most of all, remember to check the license. Don't assume you can use code just because you found it on the internet. Thank you.